I'll create a dark historical narrative based on your theme about the 47 patients who disappeared overnight from a hospital with no records. Here's the first block of the story. Block 1. The town of Millbrook, nestled in the foggy valleys of northern Vermont, was once known only for its apple orchards and the small psychiatric facility perched on Raven Hill. Few outsiders ever ventured there, and fewer still took notice when, in the bitter winter of 1953, something happened that the townspeople would spend decades trying to forget. According to the remaining fragments of county records, 47 patients were registered at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital on January 15th. By dawn on January 16th, not a single one remained. No transfers were documented, no deaths were recorded, no explanations were offered. The official statement claimed a clerical error, that the patients had been gradually transferred to other facilities over previous months, and the paperwork had simply been misplaced. But the night nurse's log, sealed by court order until 1987, tells a different story. All rooms checked at midnight, all occupants accounted for. It was the last entry she would ever make. For decades, families received vague letters about relocated loved ones, yet no one could visit them. Photographs sent home showed vacant eyes and strange postures. Some relatives insisted the people in these photos weren't even their family members at all. When investigative journalist Helen Mercer finally uncovered a cache of hidden hospital communications in 1992, she found something disturbing: correspondence with research institutions across the country referring to the 47 subjects and unprecedented neurological results. Are you brave enough to discover what really happened that January night? The truth isn't about ghosts or monsters lurking in hospital corridors. It's about something far more terrifying. What happens when those entrusted with healing decide some minds are more valuable for experimentation than for saving? Millbrook was the quintessential New England town: church steeples punctuating the skyline, Victorian homes with wraparound porches, and polite neighbors who minded their own business, perhaps too well. The psychiatric hospital stood 3 miles outside town limits, its red brick Victorian architecture betraying its origins as a 19th-century tuberculosis sanatorium. By the 1950s, it had been converted into a state-of-the-art facility for treating the mentally disturbed. Tall iron gates surrounded the property, and the road leading to it was often shrouded in mist rising from the nearby river, as if nature itself wanted to hide what happened there. The hospital was run by Dr. Malcolm Werner, a man whose reputation preceded him. He had served as a military psychiatrist during the Second World War, developing methods to quickly return shell-shocked soldiers to combat. His techniques were both praised and whispered about in medical circles. With him was a staff of 20 nurses, primarily from the local community, who were grateful for steady employment, and 3 junior doctors fresh from medical school, eager to learn from the renowned Dr. Werner. The early 1950s marked a transformative era in psychiatry. New drugs promised to quiet troubled minds, while experimental procedures offered hope for conditions previously deemed untreatable. Behind this optimism lurked darker currents: intelligence agencies seeking mind-control techniques, pharmaceutical companies racing for patents, and ambitious doctors dreaming of Nobel Prizes. In this climate, ethical boundaries blurred easily, especially in remote facilities where oversight was minimal and patients were often those society had already forgotten: unwed mothers, homosexuals, the chronically depressed, and political dissidents labeled unstable. The hospital's records described its approach as progressive, a term that in Millbrook came to mean patients had become subjects in a grand experiment, one conducted behind closed doors with the silent complicity of local authorities who welcomed the federal research grants that flowed into the town's economy. Thomas Green was just 17 when he took a job delivering groceries to the hospital kitchen each Tuesday. On January 14, 1953, he arrived earlier than usual, eager to finish his route before an approaching snowstorm hit. As he unloaded crates near the service entrance, he noticed unusual activity. Government-type cars with out-of-state plates parked in the staff lot, men in suits carrying metal cases through the side door. When he mentioned this to the kitchen manager, Mrs. Holloway, she quickly hushed him. "You don't see nothing here except food deliveries, boy. You understand? Nothing else." But Thomas saw more than cars that day. While stacking crates in the storage room, he heard a commotion in the hallway beyond. The squeak of gurney wheels and muffled voices. Through the cracked door, he glimpsed patients being moved to the hospital's east wing, an area usually kept locked. Their faces were blank, eyes unfocused, bodies compliant. One woman turned toward him momentarily, her mouth forming a single word that looked like "help," before a nurse guided her head forward again. That night, Thomas told his father, the town's hardware store owner, who warned him against spreading rumors. "That hospital keeps this town alive, Tommy. Don't go making trouble where there isn't any." But Thomas couldn't forget the woman's eyes, the awareness trapped behind them, like someone drowning just below the surface of still water. The following morning, when Thomas mentioned what he'd seen to Sheriff Collins, the man simply laughed. "Imagination runs wild in boys your age, Doctor. Werner's doing important work up there. National security stuff from what I hear. Best leave it alone." But later that day, Thomas saw the sheriff's car heading up the hospital road, and when it returned, Sheriff Collins looked pale and refused to meet anyone's gaze at the diner that evening. What Thomas couldn't shake wasn't what he'd seen. It was what he'd smelled near that east wing door. Something chemical and sharp, but underneath it, something else. Something that reminded him of the slaughterhouse outside town, metallic and wrong. That smell would haunt his dreams for decades to come, along with the woman's silent plea and the memory of what happened next. By late December 1952, residents of Millbrook began noticing changes in patients who occasionally came into town for supervised outings. Sarah Miller, who had suffered from melancholy since her husband's death, now walked with rigid posture, her once expressive face blank. Robert Jenkins, known for his harmless delusions about government conspiracies, now sat silently on benches, staring at nothing for hours. When his sister visited from Boston, she left in tears, insisting, "That's not Robert anymore. His eyes are empty." Town physician Dr. Williams noticed puncture marks on Sarah's arms during a chance encounter at the pharmacy. When he inquired about her treatment, she responded in a monotone voice, "I'm much better now. Dr. Werner has helped me see clearly." Her words seemed rehearsed, her inflection flat. When Dr. Williams attempted to follow up with the hospital, his calls went unreturned. Families receiving their monthly update letters noticed changes too. The handwriting of loved ones became uniform, the content repetitive. "I am well. The treatment is helping. Please don't worry." Some letters contained odd phrases. "My mind is quieter now," or "I understand my purpose." When relatives visited, they were often told their family members were in treatment or resting and couldn't receive visitors that day. By early January, even the most compliant patients showed troubling symptoms. Nurse Eleanor Bennett, who had worked at the hospital for 15 years, confided to her sister that something was wrong. "They're like shells of themselves. No emotion, no resistance. Even the ones who used to fight taking their medications now line up without a word. And those new injections, they're not on any medical charts I can find." Eleanor Bennett was not the only staff member to notice disturbing changes. Orderly James Wilson observed patients returning from the East Wing with peculiar marks behind their ears or at their temples. When he casually inquired about these marks to Dr. Werner during rounds, the doctor dismissed them as minor irritation from new therapeutic equipment. The next day, James was reassigned to the grounds crew, forbidden from patient contact entirely. The hospital's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as January progressed. Staff noticed armed guards stationed discreetly at exits. Supply deliveries increased. unusual equipment arriving in crates marked only with numbers and government seals. The most troubling change came in patient treatment schedules. Individuals disappeared for days at a time, returning docile and disoriented. Their medical charts contained gaps, sometimes entire pages removed and replaced with minimal notes. Treatment progressing as expected. Among the patients, one woman stood out for her continued resistance. Catherine Walsh, a 32-year-old former literature professor committed after challenging her university's dismissal of female faculty, maintained her sharp intellect despite increasing medication. Staff whispered that she was unresponsive to treatment, a phrase that had become ominous within Millbrook's walls. Catherine had begun keeping detailed observations, scribbled in the margins of the poetry books she was still allowed. Between verses of Dickinson and Frost, she documented changes in fellow patients, staff behaviors, and her own symptoms when she pretended to swallow the increasing doses of medication. "Something is happening in the East Wing," she wrote in nearly microscopic text. Margaret returned, unable to recognize her own name. David came back, speaking in numbers. They're breaking minds apart, searching for something. At night, Catherine pressed her ear to the heating vent in her room, capturing fragments of conversations from the doctor's offices below. Words like conditioning, memory suppression, and identity reconstruction filtered up through the pipes. Once, she clearly heard Dr. Werner say, "Washington expects results before funding renewal in February. The first 47 subjects must show significant progress." When Nurse Bennett found Catherine's annotated books during a room search, she should have reported them immediately. Instead, she read them in the silence of the medication room, her hands trembling. The next day, she smuggled in a small notebook for Catherine, whispering, "Keep it hidden. I want to help." It was the first alliance in what would become Catherine's desperate bid for survival, and the first evidence that would eventually expose the truth. Catherine documented the treatments with clinical precision. Patients received 3 types of interventions: chemical injections that induced amnesia and heightened suggestibility, electrical stimulation targeted at specific brain regions, and psychological conditioning using visual and auditory cues combined with either pain or pleasure. Those who showed promising responses disappeared to the restricted basement level. None had returned. As Catherine filled her hidden notebook, she noticed patterns in who was selected for the most intensive procedures, those with high intelligence, creative backgrounds, or particularly resilient personalities. "They're not treating illness," she wrote. "They're testing how to break strong minds and rebuild them to specification." By January 14th, Catherine knew her time was running out. Dr. Werner had scheduled her for comprehensive therapy in the East Wing the following morning. That night, Nurse Bennett slipped her a sedative to help her sleep, but beneath the pill was a folded message. "They're clearing out patient records. Something's happening, be ready." What Catherine couldn't know was that Thomas Green had spooked the operation with his questions around town. A midnight call from Washington had ordered immediate protocol termination, a euphemism whose meaning would soon become terrifyingly clear. On the night of January 15th, a massive snowstorm hit Millbrook, dropping over 14 inches and effectively cutting off the remote hospital from town. Through the howling wind, Catherine heard unusual activity in the hallways, the squeak of gurneys, hushed, urgent voices, and the rumble of vehicles outside despite the weather. Peering through her frosted window, she saw military transport trucks with canvas-covered backs idling by the service entrance, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow. One by one, rooms around her fell silent. Using a hairpin to unlock her door, a skill learned from a fellow patient with a questionable past, Catherine slipped into the hallway. The nurse's station stood abandoned, medication cart left unattended. Patient rooms along her corridor lay empty, beds stripped bare as if never occupied. In the administration office, filing cabinets stood open, their contents gone. A burning barrel outside the window glowed orange against the white landscape, feeding on what appeared to be patient files and records. Catherine grabbed what papers remained: requisition forms for medications not approved for civilian use, shipping manifests for equipment from military research facilities, and a partial patient transfer list with only numbers where names should be. As she moved toward the east wing, Catherine found doors left ajar that had always been locked. The treatment rooms contained equipment she had never seen in medical textbooks: helmets with electrode arrays, isolation tanks fitted with speakers, and custom examination chairs with restraints and unusual attachments. On a clipboard, a single sheet remained: subject evaluations for Phase 2 transfer, 47 approved. The sound of approaching voices sent Catherine hiding inside a supply closet. Through the slats, she watched Dr. Werner and a man in military uniform walk past. "The transport to the new facility is almost complete," the uniformed man said. "We'll have them at the mountain location by morning." "And the local situation?" Werner asked. "Being handled. Official story is administrative reorganization. By tomorrow, it will be as if these patients never existed here. And the staff? Non-essential personnel have been dealt with. Nurse Bennett and Dr. Calloway proved problematic. They've been added to the research cohort. We need to move quickly. That delivery boy has been asking questions." Catherine's blood ran cold at the mention of Nurse Bennett. Her one ally had been discovered. As their footsteps faded, she knew she had minutes, not hours, to escape. The storm might have been her death sentence, but it could also be her only chance, the cover she needed to flee undetected. Gathering the documents and her notebook, Catherine wrapped them in waterproof bandages from the supply closet, binding them to her inner thigh. Taking a lab coat and ID badge from a hook, she transformed herself from patient to staff. The final piece was a medical mask, protection against the cold, but more importantly, concealment of her identity. The service entrance had only one guard now, most security having moved to the transport area. Catherine approached with purpose, clipboard in hand. "Final supply inventory for transport," she said, mimicking Nurse Bennett's confident tone. "Dr. Werner needs verification before the last truck leaves." The guard hesitated, looking her over. "They're waiting," she added sharply. "Unless you want to explain the delay to the colonel." He stepped aside, and Catherine walked into the blizzard, into a frigid darkness that offered more warmth than what she left behind. The wind whipped against her inadequate clothing as she moved away from the lights, towards the forest where she might find cover. Behind her, the hospital continued its methodical erasure of 47 lives. What she didn't know then was that she would be the only one to escape. The only witness to a program that would vanish from history as completely as its subjects disappeared into that snowy night. Catherine Walsh survived that frigid night by sheltering in a groundskeeper's shed half a mile from the hospital. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving an unnatural stillness across the snowbound landscape. From her hiding place, she watched military vehicles depart one by one until the facility stood empty, its windows dark like vacant eyes. No ambulances had come, no local authorities had been notified, just systematic removal under cover of darkness and weather. When she finally risked the trek into town, her body nearly frozen and her mind racing with horrors witnessed, Catherine found Millbrook changed. People averted their eyes as she passed. Shops closed early when she approached. The local newspaper ran a small notice about administrative changes at the hospital, with patients relocated to better-equipped facilities across the state. Not a word about 47 missing souls. It was Thomas Green who finally answered his door when she knocked. His young face had aged years in days. "You're one of them," he whispered, eyes wide with recognition despite never having met her. "One of the ones they took, one they failed to take," she corrected, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "I need your help." Inside his family's modest home, Catherine spread out her salvaged evidence, requisition forms, partial staff notes, and her detailed notebook. Thomas added his own observations as the delivery boy, creating a disturbing mosaic of systematic abuse disguised as treatment. But when they brought this evidence to Sheriff Collins, he refused to even look at the documents. "There's nothing to investigate," he insisted, eyes fixed on a point beyond them. "The state authorized all transfers. Everything was done properly." But his hands shook as he lit his cigarette, and Catherine noticed a new watch on his wrist. Expensive, beyond a sheriff's salary. They tried the local newspaper next. Editor Frank Simmons listened politely, took careful notes, and promised to look into their claims. 3 days later, his paper ran a feature praising Dr. Werner's pioneering work and his new prestigious position at a government research facility. The article mentioned generous donations to improve Millbrook's schools and infrastructure. "They've bought the town's silence," Thomas realized as they sat in his father's shed, their evidence spread out between them like pieces of a horrific puzzle. "No one will help us." But Catherine wasn't finished. Using Thomas's family telephone, she placed a collect call to a former colleague from her university days, now working at a small but respected scientific journal in Boston. Dr. Eleanor Richards had once championed ethical research standards before such concerns were fashionable. Within days, she arrived in Millbrook under the pretense of historical research. "This goes beyond one hospital," Dr. Richards whispered as they met secretly in the town's cemetery. "There are reports of similar research programs across the country. Patient disappearances, unorthodox treatments, military involvement." She examined Catherine's notebook with growing horror. "This is the first concrete evidence I've seen." The three formed an unlikely alliance: a teenage delivery boy, a psychiatric fugitive, and an academic, united by their determination to expose the truth. Dr. Richards provided them with camera equipment to document the now abandoned hospital before evidence disappeared completely. What they found inside Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The patient wings had been stripped bare, beds, equipment, and personal belongings all removed, but in their haste, the cleaning crews had missed crucial details. Scuff marks on floors showed where restraint chairs had been bolted down. Wall outlets had been modified for equipment requiring unusual power specifications. In the basement, behind a hastily removed false wall, they discovered a small laboratory space with refrigeration units still humming. Inside these units, labeled specimens told the most damning story. Tissue samples marked only with numbers, vials of blood and cerebrospinal fluid, and most disturbing, preserved brain tissue sections. Each labeled with patient numbers corresponding to Catherine's list of the missing 47. "They weren't just conditioning minds," Dr. Richards whispered, her scientific detachment crumbling as she examined the samples. "They were studying brain physiology changes during psychological breakdown. These people weren't patients, they were test subjects for some kind of cognitive restructuring program. Their investigation revealed a program codenamed MindWell, designed to explore methods of breaking and rebuilding human consciousness. The goal appeared to be creating individuals who could be programmed with new identities, memories, and loyalties. The Millbrook patients had been merely phase 1, testing which methods most effectively erased existing personalities to create a blank slate for reprogramming. Thomas discovered shipping manifests indicating the surviving subjects had been transported to a facility listed only as Mountain Site Alpha somewhere in Colorado. When Dr. Richards attempted to trace this location through academic connections, she received an unambiguous warning from her department chair. "Drop this immediately if you value your career, and possibly your life." 3 weeks after beginning their investigation, their evidence was nearly complete. Catherine had organized their findings into a comprehensive report, documenting the systematic abuse of vulnerable patients under the guise of treatment. Dr. Richards had prepared an academic paper detailing the unethical experimental protocols and their violation of medical standards. Thomas had photographed everything, creating a visual record that couldn't be dismissed as delusion or conspiracy. The night before they planned to leave for Boston, where Dr. Richards had arranged a meeting with trusted journalists, Catherine awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Men in dark clothing moved through Thomas's house with practiced efficiency. The three investigators escaped through a back window, but their evidence didn't. The comprehensive documentation of Mindwell's atrocities disappeared that night, along with any hope of immediate justice. "We need to separate," Dr. Richards insisted as they huddled in the woods outside town. "They'll be looking for 3 people traveling together." She pressed train tickets into their hands. Different destinations, different departure times. "Memorize what we've learned. Write it down when you're safe. One day, the truth will emerge." Catherine Walsh traveled west, eventually settling in a small Oregon coastal town under an assumed name. She taught literature at a community college, living quietly but always looking over her shoulder. Thomas Green joined the military, ironically enough, working his way into intelligence services where he spent decades searching classified archives for mentions of Mindwell or its subjects. Dr. Richards returned to academia, subtly shifting her research to focus on ethics in psychiatric treatment, publishing papers that indirectly questioned practices resembling those at Millbrook. None of them ever found conclusive proof of what happened to the 47 patients after that snowy January night. Occasional reports surfaced. A former patient spotted working at a government facility with no recognition of their past. Medical studies published with methodology suspiciously similar to Millbrook's protocols. A military training program using psychological techniques that mirrored Dr. Werner's work. In 1976, a congressional investigation into unethical government research briefly examined claims about Millbrook, but witnesses mysteriously withdrew their testimonies. Records requested under newly established Freedom of Information laws returned heavily redacted documents or claims that no such facility had ever existed. The hospital itself was demolished in 1962, replaced by a Veterans Memorial Park with no mention of its previous purpose. Catherine lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Cold War secrets begin to surface. In 1995, as government archives slowly opened, a journalist named Michael Holloway began investigating rumors about mind control experiments. His research led him to the quiet professor in Oregon who had once been Catherine Walsh. "I've spent my life waiting for someone to ask the right questions," she told him, her hands trembling as she extracted a water-damaged notebook from inside a hollowed-out copy of Jane Eyre on her bookshelf. It was never about treatment, it was about control. They discovered that breaking a human mind requires 3 things: isolation, disorientation, and fear. Once broken, those minds could be rebuilt to specification. The article Holloway published won journalistic awards, but was largely dismissed as sensationalism built on the testimony of an elderly woman with a questionable psychiatric history. Catherine Walsh died 3 months later of apparently natural causes, though Thomas Green, by then retired from military intelligence, had his doubts. The truth about what happened to the 47 patients of Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital remains buried in classified archives and unmarked graves. The program they unwillingly advanced likely continued under different code names in different facilities, its techniques refined for purposes only a few would ever know. Today, the town of Millbrook thrives as a picturesque New England community proud of its historic architecture and beautiful mountain views. Few residents know the history of Raven Hill, where only foundation stones remain among overgrown weeds. Fewer still notice how the local cemetery lacks any graves from January 1953 or why certain families left town so abruptly that winter. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is not what was done to those 47 individuals, but how completely they vanished. Not just physically, but from memory and record. In the end, the greatest success of Mindwell wasn't the breaking of minds, but the erasure of humanity. Proving that with enough power and secrecy, people can be made to disappear not just from sight, but from history itself. When science abandons conscience, progress becomes indistinguishable from atrocity, a darkness masquerading as light, claiming victims whose screams history will never record.